Today I'm chatting with repeat guest Hal Hughes. Hal Hughes is a
psychotherapist
and an all-around awesome human being. Retired police officer and now helps those in the first responder community deal with trauma and get back on their feet. We had such an awesome conversation because this dude is legit. We chat about stoicism and what it means to be a complete human being and how to take control of your life and how to not be so anxious all the time. Another awesome episode, one not to be missed. Stay tuned. Three, two, one. Hey, folks, we've got Hal Hughes on again. Hal was a guest in the original season of the podcast. I can't remember the episode number because I'm poorly organized, but we'll make sure to put that in the show notes so that you can reference it. Hal is a pretty interesting cat, and I highly recommend you go check out his original episode. So he gives a really detailed explanation of where he's coming from, and we'll touch base a little bit on that, but I wanted to have him back on the show to chat about the state of our mental health, because Hal has a unique perspective, being a former police officer and now working as a, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hal, but as a psychotherapist. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, I'm in private practice as a psychotherapist.
Right. So there you go. And works a lot with those that are serving as police officers and retired police officers. And I believe some military as well, and veterans as well, right, Hal?
Yeah, it's primarily first responders and military vets. It's mostly what I do.
Right on. So how about we start with just a brief introduction of who you are, what you do, and then we'll get right into what you're seeing as a therapist in the first responder space, and we'll bounce around different topics and shoot the shit for the next power hour or so, and hopefully figure out what's wrong with the world and come up with some solutions. All right.
Well, this is going to be a very densely packed hour. Yeah, so just very quickly where I came from, where I am now. I was in federal corrections as a correctional officer. I wasn't doing time. I was an officer there. And then that turned into becoming a police officer, did that for the better part of 17 years. And then got hurt on the job pretty severely. A bad, was diagnosed moderate traumatic brain injury. Obviously, it took me several years to recover from that. When I was at the point where I could have gone back to work, I couldn't have done front line just because I can't take another hit to the melon. So decided to go back to school instead, got a master's degree, some more letters after my name, and decided to continue to contribute and serve my fellow brothers and sisters, primarily working with first responders now as a clinical psychotherapist. I was recently accepted into a doctoral program at another graduate school, but I'm putting that off for now as I'm putting too much energy and time into my clinical work right now. But that's on the distant horizon to continue my education.
Right on. It's always good to have a letter salad at the end of your name. Makes me feel good
Yeah.
about myself. I don't know what it is, right? Just it's like I mean
Oh,
something. I've got
absolutely.
letters at the end of my name. I love
Yeah, it's
it.
status, right?
How
And
you're also right status. Yeah, of course. You're also neglecting to mention too. You're not just like a typical psychotherapist. Like obviously, yeah, there's the police background, but you've got a pretty cool background in fighting as well. Like my therapist don't have a sick set of ink all over their arms. So you definitely have a different perspective on things, and you look different than most psychotherapists. So what's the deal with that? Like, how's that reflect in your
well,
practice?
it's kind of interesting you brought that up because the last client who I saw before getting on with you today was the first time I was meeting this client, and their first comment was kind of they were taken aback when I opened the door, and they said, "Wow, you don't look like what I thought you were going to look like. I thought you were going to have like a white beard with like glasses down at the end of your nose, and I didn't expect what you're presenting here." So what's interesting though is I find that for some people it's almost like a relief. It's like, oh, okay, here's an imperfect, heavily tattooed, kind of regular guy. He's not, the stereotypical guy with a million letters after his name presenting with a suit and tie and whatever. And I find that it's actually kind of an icebreaker. People kind of relax into therapy when they see that I'm just a regular guy that maybe doesn't fit the stereotypes they've got in their brain on therapists. So it kind of knocks down that first wall between myself and my patients.
Absolutely, man. I know if I had walked into my therapist's office and she had like a nice sleeve tattoo and thrown a few F bombs around, I've been like, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I got a great relationship with her. She's awesome.
Yeah.
But as on a first interactions, they mean a lot too, especially if you're dealing with, police officers and military folks, right? That's part of our culture. So right off the bat, you're like, all right, we're in the club. You may
Yeah.
not be very good at your job. Who knows,
Yeah. Yeah.
but at first impressions always make a significant impact. So Hal, I wanted to chat about how we'll just get right into it. Like we'll just start off easy, right? COVID-19. How did you see the impact of being locked down? And that term itself kind of annoys me as well. And maybe you can expand on that too. um, being locked down and forcibly confined. Am I allowed to say that? Like, Quebec, anyways, was like brutal, super draconian. Did you see within your practice any kind of ripple effects or knock on effects? Especially with those that are already suffering from mental health issues, and may, or may not be part of the police or military or first responder community. Is there anything that is there anything that you're noticing as a consequence of kind of the last 2 years? Because after you bring up your piece here, I'll expand a little bit about what I've
Sure.
been experiencing over the last 2 years.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, it's almost like we've been part of a giant social experiment or psychological experiment. Let's take a pack animal. I mean, we like to think we're sophisticated mammals, but we're the same as the rest of them, except we got language, cell phones, and condos. We're a pack animal. We're wired that
Yeah.
way. Our superpower over every other mammal was that we're really good at collaborating, and we're really good in packs. And so you take this creature that's evolved and survived as a result of that, and then you isolate them. You take away their social supports and their sense of tribe, and then see what unfolds. But I think it's beyond just the social isolation that has sort of caused a lot of people's mental anguish. I think it's also, a lot of people were unable to work or to go to work. So, as humans, another thing we're wired for beyond tribe is we're essentially wired as beasts of burden, I believe. You know, like
Mm,
any beast of burden, we need to figure out what burden we're able to bear, and then we bear it each day. And there's something about that seems to be in our wiring. And when you actually see, what's interesting is when you actually see beasts of burden, back in the day when they used oxen or heavy horses to pull plows through the field. What's really interesting about that is that when the farmer goes over in the morning and rattles the gate chain to unlock it, the bull of the horse, that beast of burden, doesn't shy away. It walks towards the burden for the day, and it's not pleasant. It's got dirt in its face all day. It's hot and it's heavy. And at the end of the day, they put it back in the field and it goes. It has its hay and it rests or whatever. When they retire beasts of burden, they essentially fall into what can only be sort of viewed as a depression. It's like, I got no heavy
mm,
burden to haul anymore. And as humans, we're kind of wired that way too, which is why people, when they get retired, often end up in my office 2 years later because they've lost their sense of purpose and meaning that comes with work. And so COVID took that away from a lot of people, as well as the routines that naturally get incorporated into our lives as a result of that work. So take away a person's routine, mess up their circadian rhythms as a result, because a lot of people in COVID, I got kids, they were up all night, sleep all day. The schedules were all over the map. Same with a lot of adults, right? So take away their circadian rhythms in a stable way, take away their sense of purpose and routine with work. And then on top of that, add this layer of fear and uncertainty with the virus and its potential consequences. You got this perfect shitstorm for anxiety and depression. Because as humans, when we're faced with too much uncertainty, our natural default is to seek comfort and safety. Now, when you're locked in your house, comfort and safety represents, well, how do we get comfort? Well, the simplest way: drugs, alcohol, overeating, Netflix binges, social media, indulgences. And those forms of comfort, again, are not setting us up to feel very good.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's I don't know if there was the bargain that was struck by politicians was okay, if we do this, we're going to be able to hopefully get things started sooner rather than later and avoid as much death as possible. I'm pretty sure that was their calculus.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to be cynical, but what turns out, like for me, I like long term thinking. I hate kind of doing fly by night, just reactionary type decisions because everything's kind of happened before. Everything everything needs to be taken from that long term perspective, especially on the scale of like humanity, or let's say your entire country. And it just seemed like the people that had like dissenting voices were like, wait a second, that you're using a term lockdown. Have you ever considered that this might not be a good term just on the basis of the word itself? Like maybe that's not what we should be considering. For me, that was like that right away. That was off putting. I was like,
Yeah.
because I'm naturally defiant. I recognize that as a character trait. I mean, ironically, I was in the military for 15 years, right?
Following orders.
I don't know if you have. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's that duality,
Yeah.
right? Like, so, and you probably have a better explanation of why certain people like myself, who naturally have an affinity to push back on things, join very structured organizations like policing and the military. But that got my you know my back up essentially right off the bat. I'm like, locked down. I'm like, you're gonna say I had to. I'm like, why the fuck would I want to stay inside all day? Like, if it's an airborne disease, like get me outside, like, and get me active. Is it this bad? Okay, do I need to start digging ditches? Do I need to start like helping with bodies? Like, is it bad? Because right off the bat, my inclination was like, okay, well, how can I help? But it's like, no, sit at home, shut the fuck up, and wait out for orders. And I was like, okay, well, I'm an infantry troop or a former infantry troop. I can do that, but I can only do that for a certain amount of time before I start crawling up the walls. And, that's case in point. Like, I mean, like the times when we didn't have anything to do, we always got into
Yeah.
trouble, like a lot of trouble, right? You don't let guys just hang around idly without anything to do. And that's something, like, I mean, I've been to Ireland, and apparently the reason why there's all kinds of walls around Ireland is because the British needed to keep them occupied or else they rebelled all the time. I was like, oh, so I took that as an important note as to like why people need to be busy. And like work is one of those things. But like you said, you take away work, take away the circadian rhythms, take away the routine. And if you had kids, like now you're stuck with your kids 24/7. Now you're expected to teach them. Now you're expected to do a whole bunch of other things that you were never expected to do. And then somehow maintain some semblance of normalcy. And for 2 weeks, which turned out to be 2 years. Um, so I guess my question to you is, from my perspective, like all last year, I was not doing well. Like I just, like even though I had, my therapist and, I had a good family unit, I kept on bouncing from like good days, bad days, good days, bad days. And I couldn't regulate my emotional state. I couldn't, and I kind of understood why. And at least I had that perspective. But for those that maybe weren't, you know, in it as, you know, I guess well supported, are you seeing like an uptick of just like burnouts or of like just saying fuck it, I'm done with either, being a first responder or, like, marriages falling apart? Because I mean, like, it was touch and go for me, and I had a
Yeah.
really hard time. Like, my business just cratered. I wasn't doing what I had to do. My relationship with my kids was getting shittier. My relationship with my wife was getting shittier. Just all around. But thankfully, like, I have enough support that I was able to keep the ship afloat. And now, okay, we're moving out into better
Yeah.
waters. What it like? from your perspective, like what are you able to like kind of mitigate or help with those individuals that are just like they don't have that and they're just like is it just kind of like now you're at a point where there's just too great of a volume of people just saying like I'm done, like I'm too totally burnt out, and this 2 years just broke me.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with everything you just shared there. I mean, something interesting to sort of answer your question in a roundabout way is that what I've noticed is that, especially when it came to that last piece you mentioned about relationships in your house, with wife and kids and stuff, is I found what happened with the lockdowns is it was a bit of an amplifier. Almost in the same way, a lot of my clients, as you're aware, struggle with PTSD, my first responders and veterans. And PTSD is a little bit like this too, in terms of it's an amplifier. So when I say that, what I mean is I had a huge influx of marriage and couples counseling during and after the lockdowns. Because what happens is there could be existing issues within a marriage, but then you add in a lockdown or PTSD, even. You could interchange those two. And now what you're going to have is you're going to have an amplification of those issues. So, when you only see your spouse a couple hours in the evening, life's busy, you're both going to work, it's like there can be
Right.
underlying issues that maybe haven't been addressed. Now you lock those two people in a house 24/7. And any of those issues are going to be amplified and quickly bubble to the surface. So I had a lot of couples coming in saying, we had this decent marriage and then COVID hit, and now suddenly it's gone taking a shit. It's like, well, those issues were always there. It's just been
Right.
amplified by COVID. The same way with a lot of my first responders, they may have had sort of vulnerabilities in their personality or their ways of being in the world, but they're able to sort of navigate through life okay. But then PTSD amplifies those existing potential vulnerabilities or ways of being that weren't serving them well to the point where it could no longer be ignored. So I think COVID sort of acted like that. It was like it amplified existing issues in relationships or in individuals' ways of being.
Hmm. Interesting. um I guess a question I've had for a little while, the concept of like a moral injury.
Mhm.
I don't know much research on it. um I think those that serve that's something that is relatively, I don't know if we could say common, but I know from my own experience, I invested so much of myself into the military because I joined so young, right? It was a part of me. It was a relationship. It's not like working at like KPMG, or
Right.
I don't think people ever really fully invest themselves in a corporation,
Yeah.
so to speak. Maybe they do. I don't know. But definitely with the military and policing and that world, you kind of have to give up a part of yourself to really get something out of it. And for me, like it just gave me structure. I valued it. It allowed me to toughen up. It allowed me to realize I was good at something. So I owed a lot to it. So whenever there's something that comes up in that realm, even in the media, like I immediately have an emotional reaction to it.
Yeah.
And, having served my country and having, put literally like my ass in the line of fire for the country, for values that I were Canadian values, like I would literally die for those values. For me, all the political stuff that happened during COVID was like a slap in the face and was almost like a moral injury because it was basically saying like, you don't know what you're talking about, because I had a dissenting opinion. I felt like we were doing more harm than good. I didn't see Canada reflected in the vitriol between, each other with different opinions. And is that something that is common within, I want to say our community, I mean, I guess veterans and first responders, is that something that you're noticing coming up in the conversation? Like, man, I never thought we would go down this path, and it just feels kind of like we've been betrayed a little bit.
Yeah. Great question, Dave. So yeah, in these communities, like you say, it's not quite the same as working at a factory, because and no disrespect to anyone who does that kind of work. It's important work
Right.
too, but I think a lot of people find this call to service, this call to action, and I think a lot of times it's a result of sometimes looking for a sense of family or tribe. That sometimes it's because they didn't have that growing up, not always, but And so they're part of this family, and they're willing to sacrifice, like you were. And thank you for your service. I don't mean that lightly. They're willing to sacrifice even their own lives to be part of this family, and for their country, or for their province, or for their municipality. And I think part of when they get betrayed then by their country or their province, or by their organization, there's this deep sort of moral sense of injustice. I thought I was part of something bigger than myself, and it turned out that wasn't true. So with some of my clients, what I'm dealing with essentially is disillusionment. And
Mm.
the funny thing about that word is, when people hear it, it sounds like a negative term, but it's actually, what it literally means is the freeing from illusion. So what people sometimes run into in the first responder world is they have this sort of map for what they think their job's going to be. That it's going to be this brother and sisterhood, that we're all together, that we look after each other, that we cover each other's six, all of this stuff. And then they bump into their organization and some of their superiors and coworkers and upper management and different things, and they realize that the map they had in their mind about how it should be does not pair up with the actual terrain. Their map and their terrain don't match. And every time we have an internal representation of something, a map, and it doesn't coincide with reality or terrain, there's going to be emotional disturbance. So a lot of my clients, they're freed from the illusion that some of these families they became a part of aren't what they thought it would be. But the truth will set you free. They say, know the truth. But that doesn't mean that most of the most important truths we come to in life are still the most painful.
Now, that brings up a question based off our last conversation here on the podcast, where you brought up something that I've used now for the last 2 years, which is when you feel like there's an injustice towards you. And it could be as small as, hey, honey, take out the trash. And you're like, wait a second. It's like, you should be doing. And as soon as you go down that should hole, where it's like, no, you should be doing this, they should be doing that, you're in for a world of trouble. And I catch myself doing it a lot. And I noticed last year I was doing it more than ever. I'm like, the government should be, my politicians should be. And I was at such a high level that I had no control over. And I constantly tried to, so the thing that was exhausting was constantly trying to realize I don't have any control over this, but I'm still getting bumped.
Right.
Like I'm having those bumps, like that spike, that like, that like I want to crush my phone moment. And it was happening on such a regular basis that it was it was super unhealthy, right? Like you can't, well, I can't function on a daily basis if in the morning bump, afternoon bump, late afternoon bump, and then a buddy calls me, he's like, dude, did you see this in the news? Like it was a constant, I guess, heightened sense of
Yeah.
awareness. And having PTSD, that was never a good thing, because I retract
Right.
immediately once I get too big of a spike. And I don't know if that's a normal, or I shouldn't say normal. I don't know if that's a typical response, because I don't know the typical responses to having emotional experiences when you have PTSD. But mine, anyways, is like I'm like a cat, right? I'll just like
Yeah.
disappear. And what that means is like I go in the basement, right? Or I don't come home on time, even though I know I'm supposed to be home on time. Like I'll do these little gestures to kind of give myself some distance, which is not a good thing, because my kids are expecting me home, my wife's expecting me home, people are expecting me to be on
Sure.
a call, and I'm just kind of distancing myself from interactions, and so I'm like, I guess I'm just trying to diagnose or figure out myself with this question. Like, what what should I do?
Yeah.
This is free. This is free. I hope we don't charge me
Yeah.
for this. Like in my case, where I'm constantly worried about the higher order. Like I'm always worried about like, oh, my country's falling apart. I'm not doing enough to fix
Mhm.
it. I can't fix this, that, the other, and it
Yeah.
just feels like everything's falling apart. But then I don't have any control over
Mhm.
it, and then on top of that, I'm having these emotional bumps, and then I'm like, going all over the place and blaming people for things that they should be doing.
Right.
Is there a way to just kind of
Okay.
like center it and just
Yeah.
bring it down a notch?
How much time do we have? Do we have until next Thursday?
Oh man,
No. Okay. So
I only have to pick up the kids at
okay.
5.
So
So
let me give you a very 30,000 foot view of what's going on with what you shared with what and I think the way you shared and kind of thought out loud there, I'm sure 100% of your listeners resonated and had similar types of experiences with what you're describing, right? So the 30,000 foot view is this, and let me just I should have maybe said this off the get here, Dave. Anything that I say in terms of perspectives or approaches, nothing I'm saying and sharing with you today is original. Even people, present day people that are making, lots of help, helping lots of people and packaging different programs and stuff. None of that's original either. Most of this shit came from Greek philosophers and some of the great psychology and self help gurus from centuries or decades past. We just repackage it and say it's new. But if you do a Google search of any of our original ideas, you're going to get a million hits, and it's from somebody from 2,000 years ago. So I put that in as a caveat that anything I share, this is not original Hal Hughes material, because I'm not looking to sell anything through this. So I have nothing to lose by sharing that. So the 30,000 foot view, here it is. Um, a young man walks into a kitchen. He's heard that there's a master chef there, and he wants to, more than anything, become a chef. So he talks this master chef into taking him on as an apprentice. Master chef agrees. First day he shows up, he hands him a knife. And he says to the young Jedi, so to speak, the young apprentice, he says, "Okay, you're going to chop vegetables the first 6 months. That's all you're going to do." He goes, "But be very careful. It's a very sharp knife. It's a very sharp instrument." Young guy goes, "Okay." So he starts chopping vegetables. Master chef comes over a few minutes later. "Remember, it's really sharp. Be careful." So guess what happens within the first half day of work?
he cuts his
Of
finger.
course he does, because in an unsteady and
Sharp
untrained
knife.
hand, someone's always going to cut themselves with a sharp instrument. Okay, we've evolved across a couple million or a couple 100,000 years, depending on your evolutionary perspective, as Homo sapiens. And what we've evolved that puts us a head and shoulders above the rest of the animal kingdom is we have a really sharp instrument. The problem is when you put a really sharp instrument in an unsteady and unskilled hand, it can do a lot of damage to itself in the form of depression, anxiety, troubling ourselves over things we have no control over. It's We've got a 500 horsepower engine, but a lot of times we can take it the wrong way down a one-way street pretty fucking fast and far. So what do we do in face of that? Well, what most people do is if you got a sharp instrument and you're hurting yourself with it, we want to dull it. So there's a lot of things we do to dull the instrument. We can isolate and avoid. We can use drugs and alcohol. We can overeat. We can do a 48-hour Netflix binge. We can do all these things.
Mm.
And unknowingly, what we're trying to do is we're trying to blunt the instrument that we're hurting ourselves with, which is our own mind.
Mm.
So one of the
That
worst things we
is pretty
do,
powerful.
one of the worst things we do with this incredibly sharp instrument is we demand that the world and the universe and the people and organizations in it be other than as they are. Every time you bump up and fight the universe, you're going to lose. This is the 30,000-foot view of what most of us struggle with on day to day. In other words, the antidote to a lot of suffering in life is acceptance. You've heard the story about the guy walking down the sidewalk hearing the screams? You ever heard that
No.
story? Walking down the sidewalk, he starts hearing all these screams behind him. So he turns and he looks and he sees this friggin' truck is out of control. It's barreling down the sidewalk, just running, like slamming people off the sidewalk in his wake. And so the guy turns, he digs his heels in, he points up at the guy and says, "No, no, 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 no. You shouldn't be on the sidewalk. You should be following the rules of the road. You shouldn't hurt people." And then what happens next? Boom, he gets smoked. A wise man steps aside and lets the truck go by. But most of us are digging our heels in and pointing to the universe, our organizations, other people, politicians, doctors, whatever it is, and demanding that they be other than as they are. And so, as a consequence, we're experiencing stress, depression, anxiety. Now, So what I'm talking about is sort of a radical form of acceptance, but that does not mean acquiescence or surrender. That does not mean that because I accept things as they are, that I necessarily, throw my hands up and become a doormat to life. All it means is I'm not going to be disturbed while I attempt to do the best I can and solve the problems that were within my grasp in life.
So, Hal, funny enough, during the last 2 years, I was searching for, I guess, answers, if you want to call it.
Yeah.
And I just said, you know what? Everybody around me, like especially the special forces guys, like the hard
Yeah.
chargers, they talk about like Marcus Aurelius, they talk about the
Sure.
Stoics, they start businesses, like my buddy Mike's got Aurelius Food Co. And I'm like, whatever, man. Okay. Well, you read about some old
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. And I cracked open Meditations and I had to listen to it 3-4 times before I started like understanding. I don't think, well, maybe I don't even, I can hear it now, but understanding has taken a while. But what I've gleaned is literally what you just said. And to go back to what you were saying about none of your material is brand new. This is like the lesson that I've learned. Don't sweat it. It's going to happen. If it's happened, it's done. And therefore you're just living in the present now. Worrying about the future is anxiety, and worrying about the past is depression. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow, that's powerful shit. That is super powerful shit. And then, yeah, I was just going to ask you that question. Like, if everything is just, all right, things are happening, it just is what it is. How do you not adopt that attitude of being a doormat
Yeah.
and, just not giving a shit about anything, and then you become like a nihilist?
Yeah.
But that's not what the lesson
No.
is. The lesson is this is
Yeah.
happening. You just need to be able to accept it. And one thing that I was able to make the link to was like, this was basically how we were taught in the infantry. Like we have that, I misunderstood what stoicism
Yeah.
was and being stoic. I just thought stoic meant like something that you have a big emotional event and you just suck it up and
Right.
there's no reaction. But in reality, it's no, you have a full emotional
Yeah.
reaction, but you're able to identify that emotional reaction and then behave in a stoic
Right.
fashion, which is the concept of acceptance.
Yeah.
Like, like Marcus Aurelius, what, had like 7 children die. Like that was like, his story is
Yeah.
incredible, but he was able to move on with life and be one of the last great Roman emperors because he was able to forgive and accept and move on and run an
Yeah.
empire, which I just find fascinating that everything kind of dovetails
Sure.
into these, I guess, can we call them human truths?
Yeah.
Is that what is that what this is? Like, is that kind of what you're representing in like the modern sense? Is like the purveyor of human truth? Is that, would that be an accurate description of what your job is now?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think truth is always the antidote for most of what the people I'm helping are suffering with. Every time we speak or think something with ourselves or others that is not true, it's potentially destructive. And yet we talk to ourselves all day long, and if you're like me, half of what you might say to yourself is complete bullshit and nonsense. Like you said something earlier that I kind of clicked in on for a second. I didn't think I was going to circle back to, but it was something along the lines of, it wasn't this, but this is the sentiment I captured, that like kind of the idea that Canada right now, or like things kind of are going to hell in a handbasket type thing. I don't know if that's what you just said. Something that made me think that, geez, that it's really bad right
100%.
now. Something like that.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
that's exactly
if you were in my,
that's
if you,
exactly my
okay,
sentiment.
okay. If you were in, and people come in here all the time and say like the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Like, look at what's going on. Okay, so that would be, if you were my client, I would challenge that notion, and my question would be, which decade or century would you rather have been alive as a human? Because very like statistically speaking and very factually speaking, this is the best time to be alive as a human being. That's based on our ways of curing cancer, of clean drinking water globally, of women's rights, of incarceration rates in most countries, and levels of education for women and for people in poorer countries. Like, by every metric, this is one of the best times to be alive as a human. So anyways, so where my point there is that every time we say something that's not true, we're potentially leading ourselves down the road to some shitty emotions, right? So when we do get angry based on our shoulds of how we think the world should be, there shouldn't be lockdowns, there, whatever. Every time we do that and we get frustrated or angry, here's the great irony. With anger, as it comes up, clarity in our mind goes down. So the consequence of that is as clarity goes down, our ability to actually solve some of these solvable problems in our life gets handicapped by our own emotions. So by cultivating what you're describing around acceptance, we maintain clarity in our mind. So while we accept, that doesn't mean we don't solve the problems in these issues in our life that we have the power to solve. We just want to do it undisturbed. As an example, when I get home tonight, my kids will have put the dishes in the sink rather than the dishwasher, and they'll have thrown their clothes on the floor rather than the hamper. How do I know that? They're teenagers. Teenagers do not act like responsible adults. They act like teenagers, which is why I won't be angry when I get home and they will have done that. Now, I don't surrender and become a doormat and pick up after them. I hold them accountable, tell them the same thing I've always been telling them, give them a consequence or whatever, but I'm not disturbed while I'm doing it. So I'm not going to disturb them while I'm telling them. Nobody benefits from anger. Everything we do in life, I would say, a general rule for life, somebody should benefit from what we're doing. When we're angry, we don't benefit. Why? We're creating cortisol in our system and all that stuff, that across time creates disease, dis-ease, lack of ease. That's anger, right? So we don't benefit. When we get angry with people in our life, especially those people we love, we hurt them on one level or another. And very often we don't get what we want. So acceptance is not a passive process. It's actually one of the most masculine things we can do. It's a very masculine approach to life because what it says is this: I take fucking 100% responsibility for my emotions. And I'm never going to say shit like, he made me so mad. My supervisor made me depressed or anxious, or that guy who tailgated made me so upset. That is not a masculine approach to life. And I use that, that term sort of, and so it's like taking 100% responsibility at its core should mean taking responsibility for our emotional outcomes in life. But most people are all too willing to point the finger to something outside themselves. Last time I checked, no one out there had a magic wand and was a sorcerer making me feel anything.
That's probably one of the best ways to describe stoicism is you're in control of how you respond to your emotions. And this idea that acceptance is not a passive process, and it's a masculine process. I think it'd be safe to say like there's a certain level of aggression required there, and not in the way that typically somebody would think aggression it requires like some kind of physical violence. No, you need to get aggressive with yourself. You need to say like, I'm not going to lay blame on other people. I am going to aggressively step forward and accept responsibility for what just happened here, because you're right. Like nobody's in charge of you. I think that's something that's lost, and something that I had a hard time grappling with as well, is that nobody makes you just said, nobody makes you feel anything. You make you feel something, like, oh, he made me feel like shit. Well, what he did may have been shitty, but your perception of that is now what's causing you your disease or your disturbance, which I think is just, if we could get a grip of that somehow. And unfortunately, like we don't. I think the last places that we got these lessons was in church.
Yeah.
Where else, unless you're listening to podcasts, unless you're reading, you're not. Like, I was a teacher, but it's not something we taught. The military does it by virtue of group. I don't want to say punishment, but group engagement, right? To
Yeah.
put it in a, I guess, more soft kind of term. But it's essentially shared misery, right? Where you're all in it together, you have a mission, and you need to like not dampen your emotions, but your emotions, your ability to get the job done requires you to look at the big picture and be like, look, I can't have my emotional freak out right now because Buddy needs me. Everybody needs me. And so therefore I need to man up. I need to take responsibility. If I'm the one that screwed up, I need to be first and foremost the one that
Right.
says, look, I screwed this up, but we need to move forward and carry on. And everybody, that's one thing that I loved about being in the infantry was this idea that when you would screw up, of course he did. You didn't know what was going on. My instructors, it was just a mantra. It's like, I don't need you to apologize. I just need you to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Right.
And I was like, I love that, man. You know, because he'd be like, I'm sorry, Sergeant. I didn't mean to. They're like, hey, I don't need your sorries, man. Did you learn your lesson? Cool. Don't let it happen again. Share with buddy. And you're like, yeah, that's what men do. And that was like and then you pass it on. And then eventually I'll, pass it on to my kids and stuff like that when they can comprehend what that means. But I guess, yeah, my question is like, where do we learn this now? Where, like, if you're listening to this podcast, yeah, you're learning it now, but how many people listen to the podcast? Like a few thousand, like on a bigger perspective, where is this knowledge? Like, this is ancient knowledge.
Yeah.
This is something that was always passed on, but now we're kind of rediscovering it in a weird way through technology. But, like I haven't been to church in over a decade. Where are my kids going to get these lessons if I don't pass them on, or my wife, or whoever? Like, is that something that you're seeing? Like, people don't have just these basic skills that you would have typically had just growing up in Western civilization. And we've kind of, because we've lost them, because we haven't been kind of instilling them in our kids, that now we're growing up and we're kind of anxious and like scared of everything. And like, even though everything is great around us.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point. I mean, when you really think about everything that we do in life, we're not usually aware of it on this level, but everything we do, the reason we're doing it is because we think it's going to generate some good emotional outcome. Like when you booked the trip to Portugal, it wasn't because you like to sit in airports and get flight delays. It's because you thought when you got there, you're going to experience joy, playfulness, a sense of connectedness with your kids, some love, all that stuff. That's why you wanted that emotional outcome. The same thing when you take on a certain job, you think it's going to give you, especially in the first responder veteran role, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a structure, a family. Like these are all emotional outcomes on the other side of those things. Yet, I think anyone that heard what I just said would probably agree. Yeah, I mean, emotions determine our entire existence in terms of whether it's a good or bad one. And yet, there is at no level of our educational system courses on how to generate good emotions. So, what we're left with is this sense that we're kind of a leaf in the wind. It's like sometimes I happen to bump into happiness. More often than not, I seem to bump into anxiety or depression or worry. And so we're kind of we're left thinking that there's something outside myself causing this inner experience. And don't get me wrong, I'm not underestimating the impact that external forces can have on us. But the final say is within ourselves, what we experience emotionally. But you're right, these skills just aren't taught. So where do you find them? Like you said, podcasts, books, therapists, things like that. But I think for most people, they never go seeking the answer to that question because they don't know what the right question to ask is. They're just meandering through life trying to survive, most people, right? They haven't got to this existential level of asking themselves the question like, man, how do I experience more joy, love, courage, playfulness in my life? They're just trying to fucking pay their mortgage and manage a daycare with the kids and driving them places. So once people ask the question, the answers are fucking abundant. Like the how to of anything, whether it's managing emotions or starting a business, we are fucking inundated in this day and age. You just literally go to Google and YouTube and put how to manage emotions, and you will get 99 million hits, and 98 million of them are probably good material. It's not the how to do anything that we struggle with. It's not the strategy. It's more the reason why, because that's always a stumbling block. The reason why, because reason why is motivation. And devoid of motivation, we will quickly dissipate from our energy on trying to solve some of these problems or figure out our emotions or whatever.
Yeah.
Where did I
A
leave you
question
with
of
that thought?
motivation.
Motivation, yeah.
Yeah, that question of motivation. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to recall as to why I've gone down the path that I've gone down. And obviously it's a series of interactions and decisions, and that's in any human's life, that's you're a sum of all the decisions you've made, essentially good and bad.
Right.
And for me to get here, definitely the military was one of those things. It's just one of those random decisions when you're 19. And then that kind of sets you on a path. And then the military was over for me about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And then how did I get to where I am now, where I'm literally talking to you and we're having a pretty good discussion about ourselves, and we're discussing almost like the meaning of what it is to be human, which 7 years ago, I never would have guessed I would have been doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been one of the most enriching experiences of my life, is to be able to connect with people like you, and everybody else has been on the podcast. And I think it is the podcast that has forced me to reflect, because I get to hear the opinions of people that I never would have talked to, that
Right.
have immensely more experience and insights into certain things that I have no clue about, like what we're talking about right here, in the sense that, you have a clinical practice, you can, you see, oodles more human beings and talk to tons more human beings about like the state of what it is to be human. And so, to, I guess, wrap up, or to kind of summarize what I'm trying to get at here, is that, like, I only, really started to look deep into myself basically when I started the podcast, because I started talking to people. And I think
Yeah.
that's the biggest thing, that at least when I see or I talk to individuals that are struggling with motivation, their circle of people that they talk to is small. It's not
Yeah.
expansive. It's, it may just be like their small little community that they're in. It may just literally be their wife and their kids, or just their girlfriend. Like, their friends are not part of their network, and they may, interact on their phones, but they're not having those deep conversations. And it definitely rewired my brain, because I was definitely ending up in that kind of downward spiral. I wanted to just
Yeah.
pull away. I wanted to just, and something pulled me into this podcast space. And it might have been, like you were talking about, just kind of like our defense mechanisms, our coping mechanisms, right? Like Netflix binging and doing that kind of stuff, where you kind of avoid getting into the nitty gritty, and you're just trying to allow yourself to kind of come down and be safe. In my case, I think it was almost the opposite. I something inside me said, no, you have to do this, or it's going to get worse.
Right.
And I didn't have I didn't have that insight then, but as I look back, it was kind of like a survival mechanism. I think, was to reach out rather than just go inward.
Yeah.
And it's been the best decision that I've ever made, which is, I got into podcasting before I even had a business, and everything's kind of spiraled out of that.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what do you think about that network thing, that
Yeah.
motivation thing, where like people feed, like you gain that energy. That's what I feel.
Yeah.
I feel energetic after this chat. Like, I know I'm going to feel like $1,000,000.
Yeah.
Because I love doing this. Like, this is what I really enjoy doing. So, like, that motivation aspect, like, is it the same for pretty much every human being? Like, the people that you are the biggest motivators, or is motivation 100% intrinsic? Like, it's only you, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah. Interesting. So it's kind of a multifaceted question. I'll start in a direction, but you can reroute me if you want me to go a different way. Um, so just very quickly, I would say motivation is almost always the wrong target to rely on consistently. Motivation will get us going with whatever it is for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, but it doesn't last, generally speaking. And that's why discipline, is such a huge thing to cultivate, because discipline says that I'm going to do the things I need to do, even if I don't fucking feel like it. If we rely on
Mm,
motivation in the traditional sense of that word, what we do is rely on our feelings in the moment to decide what our actions are going to be. And if you're like me, if I rely on my feelings, I'd be 400 pounds overweight, and wouldn't be in my office right now working late and helping people, right? Because most of my feelings are the same as yours, I'm sure. They guide you towards comfort, safety, certainty, and they
mm,
pull us away from anything that's difficult, adversity, struggle, and pain, right? So discipline is just the ability to cultivate the skill set of consistently and persistently not listening to our thoughts and feelings. Because just because we have thoughts and feelings doesn't mean they're fucking true. Most of it is based on old wiring in our nervous system. It's wired to keep us safe, not help us grow and expand ourselves. So that's discipline motivation. I just want to say that. But the peer thing, I think you hit the nail on the head. Do you know what the number one predictor when they? So I worked at a federal prison years ago. The number one predictor for recidivism, or in other words, the chance that the person, if we let them go, they're going to reoffend and end up back in. You know what the number one predictor is?
We're talking men or just, I guess, mostly men.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think it's the same for both.
Not having a serious relationship.
You know, that would probably factor into it. But essentially, it's related to that. It's basically their five closest peers and social supports on the outside, who they are.
Mm,
So, in other words, we cannot, um, environment always overcomes intent or willpower. It's why alcoholics can't hang out in bars. You know the saying that you hang out in a barbershop long enough, eventually you'll get a haircut? Okay, so the
yeah,
best
right. Yeah.
predictor for offenders, if their peers are criminals or aren't, doing well in their lives, they're going to end up back in within months. That's why they're when they do plans for when they're going to release, they want to know who you're going to be hanging out with. Okay, so that's true in a negative direction in terms of criminality. It's also too, but it's much less talked about in terms of forward movement and growth in each of our lives. I could probably make a pretty good guess at what your income level is, what your level of education is, what your degree of happiness is, if I could speak to your five closest friends. I can do that with clients all day long. It's just we never rise above our social circle. I don't mean above in the sense of your sense of worth just because you make more money. I'm not talking about money. So the fact that you're sharing kind of example of that anecdotal evidence for this theory is that you weren't in a great place, but there was something inside you that said I need to expand my version of myself to save myself. And so you started this podcast and you started rubbing up against people, maybe with skills or perspectives you hadn't had in your arsenal, with big thinking, dreamers, people that are impacting others, and it's like, and what happened since then? Well, what you're sharing is that, business has taken off. You're doing really well in life. It's like, yeah, not surprisingly, because it's not your five closest peers, like with that offender hypothetical, but it's people you're rubbing shoulders with. And whatever and whoever we rub up against, eventually we take the form of that person or thing. That's why we need to be really careful about who we hang out with. And that's not to dismiss people that are struggling in their lives. Of course, we want to support those people. I
Mhm.
try to do my best to support people every day that are struggling in one way or another. But I also have mentors and peers in my life who are cheerleaders in my life, who encourage me to expand my current version of myself, who are the first ones to squash any negative self-talk I might say out loud to them. So we have to be mindful of that. The power of peers is just, it's a huge thing.
There's a interesting story that my wife told me when she was a kid. Like, I think she was like 12. So my father-in-law basically told her, "You're not hanging out with," I can't remember what her name was, right? Like, let's call her Sophie. And my wife was like, "But why? Like, she's my friend." He's like, because she was like a bad
Uh,
seed, right? And I found that really interesting because, like like he understood at a fundamental level that, he wanted his daughter to hang out with certain people because he understood the power of those, five people, right? Even my mother did it, when I started dating certain girls. She's like, "I don't want you dating
yeah.
that girl anymore." So I still bring it up with her. It's great. And it's kind of like, as a parent now, I realize, like, yeah, of course, like, you want your kids. And if you understand that concept, like, who are you actually hanging out with, right? I know even my brother-in-law had some issues, growing up, hanging out with the wrong crowd. Got involved with some bad people, but now he's doing well. But all it takes is just you being kind of stuck in that bad network, and if you don't have the I guess the either the family member or the people that are close enough to you to be like, hey, like, let's get you out of here, like in your example, right? The rate of recidivism, and maybe you're not going to jail. Maybe you're just not motivated enough to go and get that job, to go get a degree, go do whatever it
Yeah.
takes for you to expand your horizons. Because that's how, I mean, my perspective on life now is essentially like the continue, like the tree, right? A tree is always growing. It's always putting out new leaves, and then if it's not, it's starting to to die and decay, and you need to always be kind of branching out, to use a good pun, so that you can constantly, reach out to the sky and constantly grab, whatever life is there. Because if not, then, it's sad to see those individuals that never really take those, risks and grow their networks and, experience all there's to experience. Because, like, I mean, like, I'll be honest, like, I've been invited to go down to the States for like a networking thing. Like, these things, they don't come about from just sitting on your
Yeah.
butt and like twiddling your thumbs and hoping that they happen, right? You need to make the things that you want happen by putting in the work, meeting the right people, and yeah, to expand on your, like, your network there. Like, was it like, you know millionaires don't hang out with people on welfare, and it's not because they don't like people on welfare. It's because they became a millionaire because their network is full of
Yeah.
millionaires, and therefore, they might know some, but they don't hang out with them because success breeds success. And I read about the Matthew principle. I think it's from Jordan Peterson, where, and I don't know the Bible verse well enough, but essentially, like, it's the positive feedback loop. Though, if you hang out with people that are doing good things, that are, either, successful, if you want to be a successful businessman, go hang out with successful businessmen, because the more you get, the more you'll get later. And those that have less will continually get less and less and less, because they go into a negative feedback loop. So therefore, it's really important to pick your networks and to pick who you're hanging out with for long-term success. And that's essentially what I've decided, even before I learned that principle intrinsically, to go out and branch out. So Hal, I had a few other questions I wanted to ask you,
Mhm.
but we've already crushed an hour. Um, Let me think here. Let me go through my notes, man. There's so much here. Okay. I guess the last thing, what I want to wrap up with today, was, how do you see things getting better? Because I mean, I'm assuming, this is my assumption, is that you see things, and, like, things are pretty wonky. Like, we just came out of COVID. We've got some, a lot of awareness now on mental health. Things don't seem to be getting better, but, you're a pretty positive guy. What do you think needs to be done moving forward? Let's just say on the individual level, because we don't want to talk about necessarily like governmental policy and stuff like that. What do you think an individual, especially if it's an individual listening right now, they're, even if they're not struggling, but they just want to be better, they want to
Yeah.
be a better human being,
Okay.
what should individuals start considering,
Hmm.
so that they can grow into that tree, or be
Yeah.
that better human being, and really thrive?
Okay. Let me just give one. Let me give one thing, because I mean, I could give a 4 hour answer, right? There's so many things that we can do to improve
This is the
ourselves.
thing. This
Yeah.
is the one thing in your life will just
Yeah. So if I was sort of put in a corner and had to give, like, what's one small thing that I think would bring value to all your listeners, um, it's going to be something that some of your listeners will, when they hear it, will go, yeah, yeah, I've heard that's good, and they'll kind of, I get blown off all the time by my clients who I'm trying to help. Like, it's like when I say, you should exercise, it'll help your mental health. Yeah, 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 I know. It's like, well, to know and not to do is delusion. You don't know. Anyways, if there was
I
one
like that.
thing, but I think it ties into a lot of what we talked about today, is I would encourage people right now that are struggling to embrace and cultivate some form of mindfulness practice, meditative practice in their life. Now, let me be the first to say, meditation or mindfulness is not going to fix all your problems. It's not going to do anything magical. But here's why, and I connect this back to some of the stuff we've talked about already, about thoughts and feelings, about motivation and discipline. It all kind of ties together. Um, Mindfulness, essentially, all it is, it's not about creating a thoughtless void in your head. And that's why some people get frustrated with it, because they can't do it for more than 3 seconds without getting flooded with a bunch of thoughts. Mindfulness is about cultivating a different relationship with your own mind. It's about peace with mind, not peace of mind. All meditation is having thoughts and feelings come up, and then pulling your attention back to your breath or to your body, whatever the form meditation is. It seems like, what possible good could this do? Well, here's what happens. Here's the superpower that can get cultivated across time with that. you're building the skill set of not following every thought and feeling you have that enters into your consciousness. You're building just a slight distance between yourself and your thoughts and feelings. That's all it is. But here's what happens. When I get home tonight from work, I'm going to be tired. I'm not going to feel like going for my long run tonight. And we always think the way we feel. So when I feel tired, my thoughts match up. And so my thoughts are going to be something along the lines of, oh, give yourself a break, Hal. You already worked out this morning. You can do your long run on Sunday. My thoughts are going to follow my feelings, and they're going to lead to me not going for the run, because my thoughts and feelings almost always lead me back to comfort and safety and certainty and Netflix. Okay, but through a mindfulness practice, if I've cultivated just a slight distance between myself and my feelings and thoughts, now I have space to maneuver when I get home, and that same thought and feeling comes up that wants to take me away from the run, the thing that I know is in line with my values of health. And now I'm not over identifying with them. So now I can hear the same thoughts, which tonight are going to be, you're tired, you got an IT band issue, skip the run. But I've cultivated through mindfulness the practice of not being tethered to it as if I'm on a wild horse holding on for dear life, the way most of us feel tethered to every thought we have. Now I've got distance. Now I can behave in line with my values and head out the door, tie my shoes, go out the door, even while my brain's still telling me you don't feel like running, you shouldn't have to run. And I can engage in the run. It's a superpower. Let me give you another example. I get home from work, my wife says, hey, honey, did you take out the garbage? Because I'm tired and feeling tired, my thoughts match up, and I give myself some bullshit story about why she said that. Oh, fuck, what? That's a woman's job? I cook half the time. Why didn't she do it? I've been at work all day. And I start to get myself worked up into anger. But because I've cultivated the skill set of not being tethered to those thoughts and feelings, I have distance around them. I have a level of discernment with that distance, which means I have the ability to see with clarity what's bullshit and what shouldn't be followed, and what the truth is and what should be followed. So I can have all those thoughts and feelings when she say that, discern that that's nonsense, go over and give her a kiss. So mindfulness is not a cure-all, but it's a pretty big deal in that it cultivates distance from our true selves and the thoughts and feelings that we have just bought into as being us and the truth.
That's really fascinating. I had Commander John McCaskill on, who does he has his own mindfulness practice. You know, former Navy SEAL, not the typical individual that you think would do that kind of stuff. And yeah, I learned a lot on the mindfulness side of things. As to what you were saying, it provides that ability to get a grip. That's basically the way I describe it, and to not, for me, be always. It's like the hamster wheel's always spinning. But if I can calm it down just for a little bit, for a little bit, it's like later on in the day, like where you're talking about that example, you know, like that's a daily interaction with me and my wife.
Yeah.
An innocuous comment. Hey, Dave, are you going to clean the floors? I'm like, fuck, clean the floors? Like I just did all that shit outside. I mowed the lawn.
Yeah.
What I gotta do the floors now? Like,
Yeah.
it's like all these things bubble up. Right? It's just an innocuous comment. But it gives me, like you said, that distance, that kind of standoff distance, because yeah, at the end of the day, you're tired. I don't know, like I want comfort too. Like I love hitting the couch, watching some YouTubes, and instead of just being kind of always spun up and worried about what's going to happen next, and you know, getting angry, because that's a typical emotion that I identify with really well. It's easier to just be able to just calm down, take a breath, and move forward. And that's pretty much every day. I do just a simple meditative practice. I do breathing exercises, and I don't have a scientist measuring my cortisol levels, or my reaction to different situations, but I can tell you anecdotally,
Yeah.
I feel substantially better. And that's just from what I can see, even the way I write, what I write about, what I'm thinking. Like I can see there's a level of stress that's just not there. And at the end of the day, I feel like I've accomplished something. Whereas normally I feel like, oh shit, I haven't done enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's it's really 15 minutes a day. So I love that as a piece of advice. It's really good.
It's interesting what you said there, because when we struggle in life, it's usually because we're reflexively reacting to everything. Okay, this politician is doing this, traffic is doing that, and it's just a knee jerk reaction to life. This happens, I get angry. This happens, I get sad. It's like it feels like it's just running on autopilot, and that we have no sort of control. And what we're talking about is our emotional control. So what we want to cultivate, in part through a meditative practice, is the ability to respond appropriately to life. Getting angry and frustrated and generating a lot of inner turmoil and to those around us that are within our influence sphere about vaccines or lockdowns or organizations or whatever, that's not responding appropriately to life. Because as we talked about earlier, it hurts ourselves and it hurts those around us. That's reflexively reacting to life. What we want to cultivate is like what you're describing with your wife there, is responding appropriately to life and the people in our lives. Anger is almost never an appropriate response. So meditation just helps cultivate that ability through discernment and through clarity. What are you writing down?
I have to write things down because my brain's like Swiss cheese.
Yeah.
No, as soon as you said anger, being owned by anger, I can't remember which one of the Stoics said it, but it's a short one, so I can remember it. It's he who angers you owns you.
Yeah.
And that was something that I remember I did a post about it, and that's why it stuck with me, because as soon as I read it, I was like, yeah, that is insanely powerful, because the quickness to anger, for me anyways, is like I can tell that things are not going well because I am angered quickly.
Yeah.
And and then the other thing that compounds that is, and there's a shame that comes with it too,
Sure.
because I shouldn't be getting angry. I
Right.
shouldn't be furious that my son asked to play whatever video game again that I
Yeah.
told him no. And then it kind of spirals. And then when I do get a chance to be kind of like reflective, I say, well, okay, like, why are things like off the rails? What am I doing wrong? How do I like self correct? And who do
Yeah.
I need to chat to kind of get things back on track? But unfortunately, it's it there's probably not uh, that's probably not as widespread, and like it took me years to even get close to me being able to do that. And it's nonstop work. It's
Yeah.
not like after a week of like doing some mindfulness, you're like, oh man, I'm so zen, bro. Like
Yeah.
I've got this. I've got this. Like nothing's gonna bother me now, man.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
It's almost like we're just, the goal of any of these processes and self improvement or growth, or the goal is not perfection, right? As you know, the
Mhm.
goal is, you figure out what the right processes are in your own life around growth, wellness, physical health, emotional health, relationships. You figure out what the right processes are, and then you just do those forever. This isn't a 12-week plan, right? It's like, and like you're sharing, it's like, the way I look at like getting a handle on our emotions is it's kind of like you're going down a path, and when you first get working with some of these concepts, you're way off in the ditch immediately. And the ditch represents anger, frustration, a sense of hurt, loss, betrayal, whatever it is, and then you figure out how to get back on the path, and then next thing you know, you're now you're over, but you're not quite in the ditch. You're just in the gravel, and you're sort of spending less and less time out in the woods or out in the ditch too. It's a skill set that we cultivate, and you can get better and better at it. It doesn't mean you're ever gonna live like a monk, unless you do go up to a monastery and hide from the world. But the idea is to spend less and less time in these negative emotional centers and more time in the emotional centers we want to experience. And I think what some people have never really thought about is, so many people focus on not feeling certain negative emotions. I don't want to feel angry. I don't want to feel anxious. But they haven't taken the time to write the list down of what they want to experience emotionally as targets. Like, what are your emotional targets? Devoid of a target, what's the chance of hitting it? Zero.
Mhm.
So most people have never
Mhm.
thought, what do I want to experience most of my life emotionally? And so because they don't have a target, they'll never hit it. I mean, in my own life, I decided years ago I want to feel love, playfulness, courage. Those are my three big ones, and gratitude. It's like, so if those are my targets, just like we said earlier, the how to of getting to those targets more frequently must be known, must be a Google search and a YouTube search away.
If it's not there, it doesn't exist.
No, or it's on one of Dave's podcasts for sure.
It's on one of my podcasts. Oh man, just you bringing that up is a whole other episode. How to set your emotional targets. Again, something that I just recently I was asked the exact same question. Hey, like Dave, by my therapist, like, hey, you focus on like what you don't want to feel, like, but what do you want to feel? I was like,
Yeah,
like,
there you
I
go.
don't know, I don't know. So I started identifying some. The first one is joy.
Yeah,
I recognize like, man, I haven't really been experiencing a lot of joy. And I think back to when I used to, that was like high school. That was times when in the military,
yeah,
kids were born, like my wedding, like these things. And it's just like, it's like, but as I'm getting older, I notice I'm like, well, I'm having a hard time piecing those joyful moments. It's like
yeah,
the chain is getting longer before there's another one. I'm like, I think I want to fix
yeah.
that. So that was an important insight. That was only like a few weeks ago that I identified that. And what you just said there, like yours, I couldn't write them fast enough, but obviously you put a lot of thought into them. And that's
Something you
that.
said there, Dave. Like, if you're ever looking for, like, as you kind of have experienced, I'm sure, like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel on how to be healthy individuals or happy individuals. Other people have figured it out. That's the great position you're in as someone who's got a podcast. You get to hear what other people have already figured out on some of these pathways to happiness, joy, purpose, right? So it's like, wow, okay, sure, it probably helps you on your own journey. In a very simple way, if I ever feel like I'm getting lost or getting off my own course, it's kind of a mental gymnastic to do with myself. But I always reflect back to looking at the people who seem to have joy figured out and wellness more than any other population in our communities. I look at what my kids do when they were little, especially because as simplistic a view as this is, when you think about it, kids are doing it all right. So what do kids do? Well, right off the bat, they breathe properly, full belly
Mm,
out, all the way up through their chest. Kids eat properly. In fact, they'll stop eating mid bite and they won't finish their meal. And then parents jump in and try to force them, which is, anyways. So they stop eating when they're full. They don't eat for pleasure generally, unless you teach them to do that. What else do they do? Well, they get outside every day. You have to hold a kid back from going outside in nature. He sees a forest, he's going to run into it. He sees a mud puddle, he's going to jump in it. Physical activity. If you get out of a kid's way, kids play hours and hours outside if you let them, if you provide them the opportunity to. So kids have got the keys to mental illness right there at its nucleus. What about meditative practice? They don't meditate, but they're in the present. How can we see that? They express their emotions completely and fully in the moment. And then five
mhm.
seconds later, the crying done, the anger's done, and it's like that it didn't even fucking happen. Right. So they're fully expressive in the moment creatures. If all we did was develop practices based on those things I mentioned as that kids do, our mental health for any of us would improve drastically. So breathe properly, breath work, be in the present, get a meditative practice, stop fucking eating, maybe even try some fasting practices, get outside and move your body in nature a lot.
Wow. Okay. So
Or I
we've
could be
now got
wrong.
the
I could be wrong. I'm still
we've got
guessing in
the
life too, Dave.
just we're all trying to piece it together, man. But I think we got the Hal Hughes protocol here.
Yeah.
And like you said before at the start, you're not saying anything new, but you know what? You take something old and you repackage it, man. You've got a brand, you've got a whole wealth of things that you could be doing right now. And I'll be glad to put the program together and get it online for you, Hal. So there we go. Let's fix the planet, man.
Yeah.
Breathe, eat, move better, get outside in nature, enjoy your life, man. I have to fully agree on that. And the fact that you just brought up breathing, that's a whole other rabbit hole that I just started exploring too, with the breathing practice and like
Yeah.
how shittily we breathe. And so, okay, so we've got a few other episodes I think on deck just from this one.
Yeah.
So Hal, yeah, like always, this is a freaking incredible conversation. And I already asked you the one thing you can do, and you went into like 8 different things, which is, I knew you were going to do, which is awesome. So, how, when it comes to an individual that is looking for help, uh, for, potentially deciding to work with you. I don't know if you're accepting new clients, but I'm sure you could point people in the right direction. How do people get a hold of you, and like, where are your socials at?
I think I think you can find me through a Google search. If you Google search Hal Hughes therapist, I think you can find me. I'm not sure what my
Mm-hmm.
handles are on social media. I think if you search Hal Hughes, you'll find them. Yeah.
You'll find our podcast too.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't do a lot of social media. Only when my wife says, "Hal, it's been 6 months. Post something." That then I do that on our business or on my personal site or psychotherapy site.
Right.
But yeah, so they can find me online pretty easy if they search us up. And my wife's our office manager, so if they find the website, they can call and speak to her. Yeah, all of this is
Awesome.
yeah, just a strange tangent, but while I have the microphone, um, just a message of appreciation. My wife does listen to this. She's my rock. She's my best friend. Sorry, I I almost choke up just talking about her. She's been such a rock in my life, and she's my person. So I dedicate this little
Mm-hmm.
hour and a half I spent with you to her. Thanks for giving me the space
Right
to say
on,
that,
man.
Dave.
Right on, man. Absolutely. I really appreciate you sharing with the community, that level of intensity, because it's good to see. It's good to hear. And if you're listening, go back to the last episode. And yeah, I'm not going to lie, that last episode, like when I listen to it, because I re-listen to all my episodes pretty regularly. Yeah, it hits me right in the feels, man. And I don't think anybody that listens to it will be devoid of any emotion. So you're a passionate dude, and that's why I love having you on, and that's why I love chatting with you, man. So thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. And folks, don't forget, train hard, fight easy. Peace.